The desert has a way of keeping secrets. Its winds carry voices that no one can trace, and its shifting sands bury stories before they are ever told. Before we embark on this captivating journey, we would love your support. Hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our latest stories. Then the patriarch was no longer the man who had left Ur under the stars, chasing a promise no one else could see. His beard was white, his back slightly bent from decades of journeys, wars, and altars built in lonely places. But his eyes still held the steady flame of a man who had heard God speak and believed him. Even so, there was an ache in those eyes now, an ache that came from the silence that follows great loss. Sarah was gone. The woman who had walked beside him through kingdoms and wilderness, whose voice had once been as familiar to him as the wind at dusk, was now only a memory sealed in the cave of Machpelah. The camp at Beersheba had settled into a rhythm, flocks tended, wells drawn, offerings burned at appointed times. Yet under the hum of daily life there were murmurs, whispers among the servants, glances exchanged when they thought no one saw. At first it was fragments, a passing rider from the east, a woman seen in the far distance, veiled, moving with the grace of someone who had once known courts or caravans, a name no one could quite catch. No one dared speak too loudly about it, especially around Isaac. The son of promise had his own household now, but the bond between him and his father was still fiercely guarded. The idea of another woman entering Abraham's tent felt unsettling. It was not forbidden, but it was unexpected. After Sarah, who could take such a place? Who would dare? One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a group of herdsmen returned early from the grazing fields. They gathered near the outer tents, voices low but urgent. A servant named Eliab claimed he had seen her, not in the distant haze this time, but close enough to hear her ask for water. Her accent was strange, heavy with syllables from the lands beyond the Jordan. She wore no jewelry, but her eyes, he said, were sharp, the kind of eyes that saw through a man and left him unsettled. No one could say for certain why she was there. Some thought she was a widow seeking work in the camp. Others whispered that she carried a message from some distant tribe. But the oldest servant, Eliezer, said nothing. He had served Abraham long enough to know that not all arrivals in this household were accidents. Sometimes God's purposes arrived quietly, wrapped in the ordinary. Still, the camp was restless. The desert thrives on routine, and anything or anyone that disrupts it becomes a subject of fascination. The veiled stranger had not yet entered Abraham's tent, but it was only a matter of time. That night the wind picked up, moaning through the acacia poles and tugging at the tent flaps. Abraham sat alone by the fire, the shadows stretching long across the sand. His hands rested on his staff, his gaze fixed not on the flames, but on the darkness beyond them. Somewhere out there, unseen, was the next chapter of his life, a chapter no one expected him to have. In the servants' quarters, the whispers turned into quiet speculation. Was she beautiful? Was she young? Was she from a noble family or a tribe with something to gain? The desert, they knew, did not give up its mysteries easily, and yet, somehow, everyone sensed that this was more than a traveler's chance crossing. Far beyond the campfires, under the same stars that had once called Abraham out of Ur, a woman moved steadily toward Beersheba. Her steps were measured, her face hidden, her thoughts known only to God. Somewhere deep within her heart, she carried a story, one that would one day be reduced to a single line in the ancient scrolls, but in this moment was still unwritten. The desert winds carried her approach, like a secret waiting to be told. And though no one in the camp could name it yet, change was coming. The kind of change that would stir old loyalties, test unspoken boundaries, and write her into the life of a man whose name was already etched into eternity. For now all anyone could do was wonder, and wait. The Stranger at Beersheba. Morning in Beersheba began like any other, the slow untying of the goats from their night posts, the groaning of leather buckets as they dipped into the well, the warm smell of bread rising from clay ovens. But on this morning the camp's quiet rhythm was interrupted. From the east, cutting across the low hills in the pale ribbon of dawn, a single figure approached. It was the kind of sight that made people pause without realizing why. The servants at the well stopped their chatter. 2 children, chasing a lamb, slowed and watched. Even the dogs, usually quick to bark at strangers, stayed oddly still. She moved at a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant, each step deliberate, as though she had measured the distance between herself and this camp long before she began her journey. Her garments were travel-worn but well kept. A thin veil shielded her face from the morning glare, but did not hide the set of her jaw or the quiet command in her posture. A leather flask hung at her side, the kind used by traders who knew how to survive long miles without a caravan. When she finally reached the edge of the camp, she stopped, as if taking in the place where her life was about to change. It was Eliab, the same herdsman who had first spoken of her, who stepped forward. "Peace to you, stranger," he said cautiously. "What brings you to the tents of Abraham?" Her answer was not the rehearsed plea of a beggar, nor the proud greeting of a noblewoman. It was simple, spoken in a voice that carried both weariness and resolve. "I seek the man who walks with God." The words rippled through the small gathering like wind across water. No one had introduced her to Abraham by name, yet she knew who he was. Eliab glanced at Eleazar, the chief servant, who had appeared silently from the inner camp. Eleazar's face betrayed nothing, but his eyes lingered on the stranger longer than necessary. Isaac emerged then, tall and still bearing the look of a man who had not yet grown used to his father's old age. His gaze swept over her quickly, not rudely, but with the guarded appraisal of one who had learned that not every visitor was harmless. "And why," he asked, "do you seek him?" For a heartbeat, she did not answer. Then, with the faintest trace of a smile beneath her veil, she said, "Because the God who led him from his father's house has led me here." It was an answer that satisfied no one and yet could not be challenged. Isaac's brow furrowed slightly. The servants exchanged glances. Eleazar's hand tightened on his staff, as though he knew more than he was willing to say. Without further questioning, Eleazar motioned for her to follow. The path to Abraham's tent was not long, but it felt heavy with the weight of unseen threads being drawn together. Some of the women peered from behind their tent flaps, whispering. Others pretended not to notice, though their ears were tuned to every footstep. When they reached the central tent, Abraham was seated just outside, the morning light pooling around him like a silent crown. His hands rested on his knees, his eyes fixed on the stranger, as though he had been expecting her. She stopped a few paces away and bowed her head in greeting. Abraham's voice, when it came, was gentle but probing. "From where do you come, daughter?" "From the lands beyond Midian," she replied, "and from a journey longer than the miles I have walked." Abraham studied her for a long moment. Something in her bearing reminded him of the day he had first seen Rebekah draw water for his camels, the same mixture of strength and grace, but tempered with a depth that only comes from long endurance. "You have water to drink and bread to eat," he said finally. "Rest here a while." And just like that, she was in the camp. No one yet knew her name. No one yet knew the reason for her arrival. But the whispers began anew, sharper now, edged with speculation. Who was she to speak of God's leading? What did she want from the patriarch in his old age? Isaac walked away without another word, but his mind was already restless. The camp of Abraham had weathered famine, war, and loss. Yet sometimes the greatest changes came not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet arrival of a single stranger. By nightfall, the desert would already be holding its breath. Love in the shadow of memory. Abraham had buried Sarah years ago, yet her presence still lingered in the camp, like the scent of myrrh woven into old linen. Her laughter seemed to echo in certain corners of his memory. Her voice still rose in his mind when decisions had to be made. Even now he could picture her face the night the angels came, the way her eyes widened when they told her she would bear a son in her old age. Keturah's arrival stirred something Abraham had not felt in years, not simply the awareness of another's presence, but the quiet disruption of routine. He had not sought it, yet it was here. In the stillness of the mornings, when he sat outside the tent with the smell of baked bread rising from the ovens, he found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, measured, unhurried, always carrying an air of self-possession. Yet in the shadow of this new companionship was a battle only he could fight. To open his heart to someone else felt, in a way, like moving one stone from Sarah's memorial cairn. And Abraham was a man who did not move stones lightly. Keturah seemed to sense this without a word being spoken. She did not try to fill the air with chatter, nor did she shrink into silence. She spoke when the moment called for it, her voice steady, her words deliberate. She asked about the herds, the wells, the names of the shepherds. She asked about the land, not only the acres they tended, but the lands beyond, the mountains Abraham had crossed in his youth. She asked about his God, not with idle curiosity, but with the reverence of one who had heard whispers of him before. One evening, when the heat of the day had faded, Abraham and Keturah sat outside, watching the horizon darken into indigo. "You have walked far," Abraham said at last. "Most would not choose such a journey alone." "I was not alone," she replied, her gaze fixed on the first star appearing above the hills. "The road may have been empty, but my steps were led." Her answer was simple, but Abraham heard the weight beneath it. She spoke like someone who knew hardship, like someone who had buried dreams and kept walking anyway. He did not press her for details. Some stories he knew revealed themselves only in their own time. The camp had not embraced her immediately. Servants watched her with careful eyes, weighing every gesture. The women whispered over grinding stones, their glances quick and assessing. Isaac remained courteous but distant. But Keturah neither pushed for their favor, nor seemed wounded by their reserve. She worked alongside the women when bread was baked. She drew water without waiting to be asked. When a shepherd returned late with a wounded lamb, she knelt in the dust to bind its leg, speaking softly to it in a tongue few understood. It was small things that began to shift the air in the camp. A child who had been shy around her began to follow her at a distance, curious about the beads woven into her sash. A young servant, after falling ill, spoke of the way she had stayed by his mat through the night, changing the cloth on his forehead without being asked. Even Eliezer, who had served Abraham long enough to be wary of any newcomer, found himself speaking to her of wells and grazing roots as though she had been part of the household for years. One night, after the evening prayers, Abraham lingered outside the tent while the others retired. Keturah passed him on her way to her sleeping quarters. She paused, then said quietly, "The woman who came before me must have been remarkable." Abraham looked up sharply. She met his gaze without flinching. "She was," he said, "more than words can hold." Keturah inclined her head. "Then it is an honor to walk in a place she once walked." And without waiting for a reply, she moved on. Abraham watched her go, the desert wind curling around the tents. He realized then that she had not come to erase Sarah's memory. She had come to walk beside it. And in that realization, something in his heart, something long closed, loosened. The whispers in the camp were beginning to change. They no longer asked only who she was. They were beginning to ask why she had come and what God intended to do next. Keturah's presence in Abraham's tent was no longer a novelty. Seasons had shifted. Her veil was often set aside, and the household now spoke her name without hesitation. Yet it was not her grace in the daily rhythms of camp life that marked her most. It was the quiet unfolding of a promise few could yet see. She became Abraham's wife, not in the hurried arrangement of a political bargain, but in the slow, deliberate binding of two lives. Their union carried none of the youthful urgency of his earlier years. Instead, it was seasoned with the patience of those who had learned to walk in step with time itself. And in that late chapter of his life, God's hand did something unexpected. He filled their tent with the cries of newborn sons. The first was Zimran. His name spoke of song, of melody, as if the boy himself were a note added to the music of Abraham's legacy. There was something in his gaze, even as an infant, that seemed restless for movement, for trade, for the caravans that stitched the desert's scattered cities together. The elders whispered that he would become a man who carried goods and news across nations. Next came Jokshan, whose name meant snarer, or fowler. His small fingers seemed always to curl tightly, as though he would one day grasp opportunities and hold them. From his line would come tribes that lived by swiftness, Sheba and Dedan, names that would one day echo in the scrolls, their lands rich in incense and gold. Then Maiden, whose name spoke of contention and judgment. He cried more loudly than the others, his voice sharp, as though born to challenge and to lead. Those who looked into his eyes said they saw a boy who would grow into a man unafraid to speak in councils, unafraid to stand at the head of his people. Midian followed, a name that would one day be known far beyond Abraham's camp. His was a quiet strength. As a child, he often sat watching the older men repair tents or sharpen spears, absorbing without speaking. It would be from his descendants that Moses would one day take a wife, and from his land that the priest Jethro would counsel a weary prophet. But for now, he was simply a boy chasing goats between the tents, his shadow long in the late sun. After Midian came Ishbak, a name meaning "he will leave" or "he will abandon." The name sounded almost like a warning, but in the ancient way of naming, it was also a map, a hint that his path would lead him far from the camp's center. His descendants would drift northward, settling in distant lands, their identity shaped by departure as much as by origin. The youngest was Shua, wealth or prosperity. He was born during a year when the herds multiplied unusually. The wells flowed clear, and trade was favorable. Some said his name was prophetic, that his portion would be abundance, and those who came from him would carry influence born not of swords, but of plenty. With each birth, the camp seemed to shift. Laughter returned to Abraham's tent, but it was different from the laughter of Sarah's time. It was deeper, steadier, the laughter of a man who had thought his story nearly finished, only to find God still writing. Not everyone looked on with joy. In the private corners of the camp, there was quiet concern. Isaac was the covenant heir, the one through whom the promise to bless all nations would be fulfilled. Yet here were 6 more sons, 6 more branches springing from Abraham's root. The older servants remembered the tension that had once existed between Isaac and Ishmael. They wondered silently whether history might repeat itself. The rift was invisible. It began not with arguments or raised voices, but with pauses, the kind of silences that speak more than words. Isaac would pass one of Keturah's boys near the well, and instead of a warm greeting, there would be a nod, brief and cautious. At meals, the seating seemed to arrange itself so that Abraham's elder son by Sarah was at one end of the tent, while Keturah's children clustered at the other. It was not hostility, not yet, but something was shifting. Isaac had grown up with the weight of a singular truth. He was the son of promise, the heir of the covenant God had sworn to Abraham. Every story he had heard from childhood, the night sky thick with stars, the voice of the Almighty, the binding on Mount Moriah, all pointed to that destiny. But now 6 more sons bore his father's name. 6 more hands might one day reach for the inheritance he had always thought was his alone. Keturah's children did not speak of such things openly, but they were not blind. They saw the way servants deferred to Isaac. They noticed that when strangers came to the camp, it was Isaac they were brought to meet, not them. They were sons of Abraham too, and sons carried expectations. Around the campfires, the older men spoke in careful tones about the need to preserve covenant purity. The promise, they reminded one another, was not to be diluted or tangled in quarrels over land and herds. Isaac had to remain the unchallenged heir. But such talk, even whispered, has a way of reaching young ears. Abraham saw it. He had lived long enough to recognize the first cracks in a household's unity. He remembered Ishmael, the joy of his early years, the pain of his departure. He remembered the shadow that jealousy and rivalry could cast over a family. And he knew that if he did nothing, the silent space between Isaac and Keturah's sons would grow until it became a canyon. So Abraham began to act, quietly but deliberately. He spoke with Isaac first. It was not a command, but a reminder. "You are the one God chose for the covenant," he said one evening, as they walked among the grazing flocks. "That will not change. But these are your brothers. Let the blessing of the covenant not become the cause of bitterness." To Keturah's sons he gave something different, time and attention. He took each of them with him on small journeys, taught them the skills they would need beyond the camp, how to read the wind before crossing the desert, how to speak with traders from foreign lands, how to find water where the ground seemed dry. He told them stories not only of Isaac's place in God's plan, but of their own part in the wider tapestry, how God had promised that nations, not just a single nation, would rise from him. But Abraham also began to set boundaries in ways the boys did not fully understand. He spoke to Eliezer about preparing portions for each of them, gifts of livestock, silver, and goods that would allow them to establish households of their own in the lands to the east. It was generous, yet purposeful. Distance could sometimes preserve peace better than proximity. Still, even with his careful hand, the undercurrent of tension remained. Keturah noticed it in the way Isaac's eyes lingered a fraction longer on her sons when they were near the storehouses. Isaac's wife sensed it in the way some servants hesitated before serving both tables at the same meal. The desert was vast, but the camp was not. Every look, every omission carried meaning. In the evenings, when the stars spread across the sky like scattered grain, Abraham often sat alone outside his tent, watching the shadows move. He had learned many lessons in his long life, but one stood above them. Promises from God were unshakable, yet families were fragile. A careless word could fracture what had taken years to build. He was determined not to leave that kind of fracture behind. And so, with each passing season, he worked quietly, weaving threads of peace between sons who were bound by blood, but divided by destiny. The day would come when those threads would be tested. But for now, the rift was still silent, and silence, Abraham knew, could be more dangerous than open conflict. The decision came in the cool stillness before dawn. Abraham had been awake through the long hours of night, listening to the wind push against the tent walls. The years had taught him that some choices do not come all at once. They press in slowly, day after day, until there is no place left to stand but on the side of obedience. He called for Eliezer, the faithful steward who had walked beside him through decades of journeys and promises. "It is time," Abraham said simply, and Eliezer, who understood his master's unspoken thoughts better than most men understood words, nodded. Time to send them away. Keturah's sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, were men now, strong and restless. The desert could not contain 6 young men of ambition and spirit within the same encampment, not when another son stood as the sole heir of the covenant. Abraham knew the promise belonged to Isaac. God had spoken it. It was not for him to divide or rearrange what heaven had decreed, yet the decision was not cold. It was not the severing of ties. Abraham's heart carried a father's love for each of them, and that love demanded he send them away with more than just his blessing. The camp moved like a hive in the days that followed. Servants prepared herds of goats and camels, measured out silver and gold, gathered fine garments and weapons fit for the journeys ahead. The gifts were generous, a dowry of honor rather than an exile of shame. For Abraham understood that distance did not mean rejection. It was protection for them and for the covenant. Keturah moved quietly among the preparations, her face unreadable. She supervised the packing of supplies for each son, ensuring no bundle was lacking, no water skin was left unfilled. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was steady, her instructions precise. Only in the stillness of the night, when the camp slept, did her composure falter. Then she would stand just beyond the glow of the fire, watching the silhouettes of her sons against the tents, memorizing their movements as if each gesture might be the last she would see. On the appointed morning, the air was heavy with the scent of baked bread and oiled leather. The sons stood ready, their gifts loaded on camels, their faces a mix of anticipation and something harder to name, perhaps sorrow, perhaps the unspoken knowledge that this parting was final. Abraham addressed them as a group, but his eyes lingered on each one in turn. "You are sons of my flesh," he began, his voice steady yet thick. "The Lord has promised that nations will rise from me, and you are part of that promise. You will go to the lands of the east. There you will grow strong, build houses, raise flocks, and take wives. You will be known for your strength and your wisdom. You will carry the blessing of your father with you." He stepped forward, placing a hand on each head, speaking words of prayer over them one by one. The blessings were not identical. Each was shaped for the man who received it, for Zamron's quick mind, for Midian's fierce loyalty, for Joktion's skill in trade. Keturah did not speak during the blessings. She stood a little apart, her hands clasped tightly before her. When her sons turned to embrace her, she met them with a quiet fierceness, holding each longer than was necessary, her lips brushing their foreheads, in a gesture as old as motherhood itself. When the caravan finally began to move, the sound of the camels' bells mingled with the faint crying of children who would never remember this day. Dust rose in slow spirals behind the departing column. Abraham watched until they were no more than shapes on the horizon. He did not weep in front of the camp, but when the last figure disappeared into the shimmer of heat, he turned away and the lines of his face deepened with the weight of what he had done. In his tent, alone, he let the tears come. Not tears of regret, but of the ache that comes when love demands letting go. Outside, Keturah sat in the shade of the tent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her hands rested still in her lap, but her heart traveled with 6 riders to the east. She had given them life, raised them in the shelter of her love, and now released them into the unknown. She did not break. She did not crumble. She simply sat in the quiet strength of a woman who understood that some sacrifices are not burned on an altar, but carried silently in the soul. And in the hush that followed, the camp returned to its rhythms. But for Abraham and Keturah, the absence was a constant, a space at the table, an echo in the evenings, a name not called at the well. The promise remained intact. The covenant was secure, but the cost of obedience had been paid in a currency only a father and mother could understand. The desert had grown quieter in those last years. Abraham no longer walked the boundaries of his herds or rode out to greet distant traders. His steps had slowed, his shoulders had bent, and his eyes, though still bright, often lingered on the horizon as if searching for something beyond sight. The nights came earlier for him now. He would sit outside the tent, wrapped in a woolen cloak, and listen to the wind speak across the sand. Keturah would join him, settling beside him in the silence they both understood. Words were fewer in those days, but they did not need them. Theirs was a companionship that had been tested by years, by joy, by the ache of farewells. One evening, as the sun bled into the hills, Abraham took her hand. His was thin, lined with the veins of age, but it still carried a quiet strength. "Keturah," he said, his voice low, "I have seen the promise, and I have lived to see more than I deserved." She turned to him, waiting. "I will sleep soon," he continued, "and I will sleep until the one who called me from Ur calls me again." She did not weep. She had known this day would come. Instead, she leaned closer, her forehead resting lightly against his temple. "You have walked far," she said. "Rest will be a gift." In the days that followed, Abraham summoned his children, Isaac, the son of Sarah, And the sons of Keturah, who had returned from the east, when word reached them that their father's strength was failing, the camp grew full with their presence, a living testimony to the breadth of his life. Isaac came first into the tent, kneeling beside his father. Abraham's hand rested on his head, and the words spoken were heavy with covenant, the unbreakable promise God had sworn, the blessing that would shape the destiny of nations. Through you, my son, the nations will be blessed. Walk before him and be blameless. Then came Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Over each one he spoke not the covenant, for that belonged to Isaac, but blessings fit for their paths, long life, fruitful lands, wisdom in trade, strength in battle, peace among their people. These were not lesser blessings. They were the seed of nations in their own right, part of the wider tapestry God had promised. Keturah watched from the shadows of the tent, her eyes moving from sun to sun. She knew the world outside would never remember these moments. The scrolls would be brief. But here in the low light, history was being spoken into the lives of her children. In his final hours, Abraham asked to be lifted so he might look once more upon the land. The servants opened the tent flap, and the evening light spilled in. His gaze traveled over the hills, the flocks grazing in the distance, the winding ribbon of water glinting in the fading sun. And then, with Keturah's hand in his, Abraham breathed out slowly, as if laying down a great burden he had carried since the day God first called his name. His chest rose once more, and stilled. The camp knew before the announcement was made. A hush settled, as if even the wind paused. The burial was swift, in the manner of their people. Isaac and Ishmael walked together, side by side, brothers divided by history yet united for this moment, carrying their father to the cave of Machpelah. There, beside Sarah, Abraham was laid to rest. Keturah did not walk with them into the cave. That place was not hers. She stood at a distance, the folds of her robe stirring in the desert breeze, watching as the men disappeared into the shadows. She knew Sarah's name would be spoken with Abraham's for generations, the covenant wife, the mother of promise. And she, though she had shared his table, his tent, his final years, would fade quietly from the telling. But Keturah understood something the scrolls could not hold, that love is not measured by how loudly the world remembers you, but by the quiet moments where lives are shaped, faith is kept, and promises are nurtured in the hidden places. When the mourners returned and the sun slipped beneath the hills, Keturah remained alone, looking toward the cave. She whispered no words, only lifted her eyes toward the sky that had watched over them both. The patriarch had slept, and she would carry his memory, not in stone, but in the sons who still bore his blood eastward, carrying the echo of his blessing into lands yet unknown. Her name appears only once, one breath in the long exhale of Scripture. A single verse nestled in the twilight of Abraham's story, spoken almost in passing, and Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. That was all the world would see. No record of the long evenings they had shared. No account of her wisdom, her quiet counsel, the way she steadied him when the weight of years bent his frame. The ink was sparse, but her life had been full. After Abraham's burial, the camp shifted. The center of gravity had changed. Isaac held the covenant place now, and the sons of Keturah moved east, each returning to the lands where their future waited. Keturah remained behind for a time, her presence soft, almost invisible among the tents. The women of the camp still sought her for counsel, though her name would never be spoken with the same reverence as Sarah's. She taught the young mothers to weave their cloth tight, and to bake their bread in the slow heat so it would last. She told the children stories of rivers that split into four heads, of towers that reached too high, of a God who called a man to leave everything and follow. But she never told them she had been that man's wife. There was no bitterness in her silence, only the understanding that not all callings are to be seen. Yet there were nights when the ache pressed in. She would walk alone to the edge of the camp and look toward the dark outline of the hills. Somewhere beneath them lay the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham rested beside Sarah, the covenant wife, the woman through whom the promise flowed. Keturah knew her place in the story was different, not lesser but hidden. She had not been given the place of covenant, but she had been given a place of fruitfulness. 6 sons had called her mother. Tribes would rise from her blood. Caravans bearing gold, incense, and myrrh would one day trace their ancestry to her line. She had been part of God's promise in ways the scrolls did not detail. Perhaps this is why her heart stayed soft. She understood that the author of the story did not measure value by the number of words written about a life, but by the faithfulness with which it was lived. One evening, as the light sank behind the dunes, she held a woven sash in her hands. One Abraham had worn in his younger years. The fabric was frayed now, the colors faded. She traced the weave with her fingers and thought of the years they had shared, the quiet companionship, the births of their sons, the farewells, the day he had breathed his last. The world would not remember those moments, but God had seen every one, and perhaps that was the truest reward, not recognition, not the permanence of ink on parchment, but the certainty that the one who had called Abraham also saw her. He had been present in her hidden years. He had measured her tears, counted her steps, and weighed her sacrifices. In the stillness she whispered a prayer, not for her name to be remembered, but for her sons' names to be written in the book that would outlast stone and scroll. The desert wind carried the sound away, and she rose, returning to her tent. Tomorrow she would teach the younger women how to dye cloth in the red of the madder root. Life would go on, and her part in the story would remain unseen by the world. But not by him, never by him. The morning they left, the air was sharp with the smell of leather and dust. 6 sons stood at the edge of the camp, their faces lined with both youth and the burden of departure. Camels knelt under the weight of packs filled with gifts from their father, gold, silver, fine fabrics, and jars of oil. They were not being cast out. They were being sent forth. From the first cry of each newborn in Keturah's arms, Abraham had known this day would come. Isaac was the son of the covenant, the line through which the promise would flow. But God had not forgotten these other sons. They, too, carried destiny in their blood. Zimran, the eldest, was steady and strong, with the mind of a builder. His eyes often searched the horizon, already measuring the ground for new settlements. Jokshan, sharp-witted and quick-tongued, had the gift of trade, a man who could turn a handful of goods into a caravan's worth by journey's end. Medan was quiet and deliberate, the one who listened more than he spoke. Midian, fierce and passionate, carried an intensity that made others follow him almost without question. Ishbak, gentle yet firm, had a shepherd's heart. Shua, the youngest, possessed the restless curiosity of one who would always be reaching for the next stretch of road. Abraham gave them his blessing, not the covenant blessing that belonged to Isaac, but a father's blessing still weighted with prayer and hope. His hands rested on each head, his voice steady, though his eyes blurred with age. Then they turned their faces eastward, toward the lands where the sun rose, toward regions Abraham had once passed through as a wanderer, toward their own futures. Years later, the names of these sons would echo in distant places. Midian's descendants would dwell near the Red Sea, their traders moving with the caravans that brought spices and gold. It would be Midianite merchants who carried Joseph toward Egypt, unknowingly positioning him to save nations. Sheba, from the line of Jokshan, would rise as a name spoken with wonder, a land of wealth and wisdom, from which a queen would one day visit Solomon with camels laden in gold and frankincense. Shua's descendants would be known in the far reaches of Arabia, woven into the tapestry of nomadic tribes. Keturah's sons became more than just men. They became fathers of peoples, threads in the complex weave of the Near East, traders, warriors, herdsmen, and kings. They would rise and fall on the shifting stage of history, yet their beginnings were the same. 6 brothers, sent with gifts carrying the imprint of Abraham. The scriptures give us only glimpses, but the ripple of their lives can be traced across maps and centuries. And in those ripples lies a truth: God's promises were never small. The covenant blessing through Isaac was precise and unbreakable, but the overflow reached far beyond. The God who had called Abraham from Ur was not a tribal deity bound to one bloodline. He was the Lord of all the earth. Keturah had once sat by the fire, cradling her newborns, hearing Abraham speak the promises God had made to him. She knew Isaac would inherit the covenant, but she had wondered, would her sons be forgotten? The years had answered her question. Not forgotten, scattered, and in their scattering they would shape nations. There is a strange beauty in this part of the story. The sons of Keturah lived outside the covenant line, yet they were still inside the circle of God's providence. They remind us that the purposes of God are both specific and wide, like a river that flows through one channel, but whose waters seep out to nourish fields far from its banks. As the centuries rolled on, the names of these tribes would be written in the margins of history, sometimes as friends to Israel, sometimes as adversaries. But whether in alliance or in tension, they were part of the same great design, a God who keeps his word and uses even those outside the covenant to shape the world stage. The east wind carried them away from the oaks of Mamre, but the memory of their father and the faith of their mother went with them. Lessons from the forgotten wife. Her story, as the scrolls record it, could fit into the palm of a hand. A name, a lineage, a few lines about sons and gifts. The scribes did not linger over her thoughts, her sacrifices, or her heart. History often forgets women like Keturah, but heaven does not. Keturah's life speaks in the silence between verses. She walked into a camp still shadowed by Sarah's memory and did not demand a place for herself. She lived under the gaze of servants who whispered, of a son who watched her with guarded eyes, and of a husband who carried both grief and promise in his heart. She served without needing to be seen. She raised sons she knew would one day walk away from her tent. She accepted her place in a plan larger than her own comfort, a plan that would send her children eastward so that one child, Isaac, might inherit the covenant. This is not the story of a woman who won in the way the world measures victory. She did not take Sarah's place in the grave beside Abraham. She did not receive visions from God as Hagar had, nor songs like Miriam's, nor a book bearing her name like Ruth or Esther. And yet her faithfulness rippled across the generations. From her came Midian, whose land would shelter Moses before he returned to face Pharaoh. From her came Sheba, whose queen would one day bring treasures to Jerusalem. From her came tribes and traders who moved across deserts, carrying goods, news, and the slow weaving of cultures. Keturah's legacy reminds us that God's purposes do not require a spotlight. He measures greatness in obedience, not applause. In a world that often forgets the quiet ones, He writes their names in His own book. For those who feel unseen, who labor in faithfulness without recognition, Keturah's life is a whispered encouragement. Your worth is not measured by how loudly the world speaks your name. The tent of your obedience, the children of your faith, the seeds you scatter in small acts of love, all are seen by the God who forgets nothing. There is also a sovereignty here that humbles the heart. Keturah's role was not accidental. Her timing, her children, even their dispersal into distant lands, all were threads in the tapestry God was weaving. We cannot always see the shape of our own story while we are living it, but the author is writing, and every line has purpose. In the end, Keturah's story is not about being forgotten. It is about being faithful in the shadows, trusting the one who keeps His own in perfect memory. Abraham's tent was temporary. The desert paths her sons took would fade, but God's remembrance is eternal. And so the chapter closes, not with the fading echo of a name, but with the unshakable truth that God's eyes never forget His own. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. That's the only way you can help us. Keep telling the truth that saves.